Hey everyone, and welcome back to a new video. Warhammer Fest is always a pretty exciting event in the hobby calendar for me. That's because while being a fun way to bring the community together, it also celebrates much of what brought us and keeps us in the hobby today, namely that being great looking models. And despite the regular leaks that seem to precede Warhammer Fest and similar events these days, there's always something to surprise us, and this week's event was no exception. We got to see a new Leagues of Votann model, the Hyrkin Pioneer, a swathe of new Chaos Unit updates, and perhaps most thankfully of all, learnt that match play points were going to be free to get online going forward. But just as Warhammer Fest can show off some great surprises, it can also surprise us with the releases we kind of already know about, and that's where the World Eaters come in. Now, we've known for some time really that the World Eaters and Emperor's Children are set to get their own codex and models, eventually at least. After all, there are 4 Gods of Chaos and we've only got dedicated factions for 2 of them, namely the Death Guard and Thousand Sons. In addition, the Warriors of Khorne have been a fan favourite of hobbyists for some time now. We've either all collected them, thought about collecting them, or known someone who has, and it's largely because Khorne and his followers really encapsulate so much of what the Warhammer universes are all about: endless bloodshed and war in the names of greater powers. So in this video, I want to focus on that particular announcement and suggest a few releases that I expect we'll see in a new World Eaters Codex. Of course, these are just my thoughts, and I do encourage you to share your own thoughts and expectations in the comments below. So with all that said, let's grab our chain axes and jump right in. Now, my first suggestion isn't really going to count because it's so obvious, but I figure it's important to mention. Angron is going to be the poster boy for this release, and given everything we know about him, I have no doubt that he is going to be absolutely terrifying in the meta for some time after his launch. As Khorne's chosen Primark, Angron is an insane, bloodthirsty engine of destruction, and with very little strategy beyond screaming blood for the blood god and charging at the nearest thing that isn't bleeding yet, I suspect his rules will allow him to take an incredible amount of punishment from range attacks, while his speed gets him into combat as quickly as possible. But perhaps more importantly for all of us, the model itself is sure to be phenomenal. You only have to look at some of the artwork of the Horus Heresy to see how commanding Angron's stature and presence is on the battlefield, and to feel that reckless insanity that drives him ever on into the maelstrom of war again and again. With Jez Goodwin and the rest of the Warhammer Studio design team working on him, I'm certain that Angron is going to be one of those models that achieves collector status immediately on release, and he may well be the launch point for many a World Eaters army in the near future. And speaking of which, what else might be joining Angron as he emerges from the warp and into real space? Well, again, looking at the releases for the Death Guard and Thousand Sons, I think it's safe to assume that we'll be getting a unit of dedicated Khorne Terminators and a cultist unit of some kind, which makes sense. After all, Khorne has a pretty unique aesthetic, and your box standard Terminators and new cultists, however great they look these days, won't really leave much room for that. Personally, I'd like to see the Terminators borrow a little from what we've seen from Khorne's warriors in Age of Sigmar, notably the helmets crowned with Khornate iconography and wielding a mix of chain weapons and hammers with which to rend and pummel their enemies into wet puddles. I also expect we'll see substitutes for the heavy flamers and Reaper autocannons that normal Terminators have access to. That's because those weapons are not only a little vanilla for the World Eaters, with other legions having their own flavour of loadouts, but also because being such a combat themed army, they'll likely need other options to replace units they either don't use or don't have access to, such as Havocs, because how can you cleave skulls from half a mile away? So with that in mind, I expect we may see some cool looking anti-horde and anti-tank weapons to help our Terminators soften up the enemy before the real fun begins. Perhaps a crude variant of the assault cannon and multi-melter, but your guess is as good as mine. And for their cultist followers, I think we'll see something similar to the Zangors and Poxwalkers, a blend between the human and demonic, likely humans that have truly been driven insane by their bloodlust and blessed with mutations that help them to rend their foes even easier. I think we got a sense of how that might look with the new Accursed Cultists, which are superb and will look incredible in any unaligned Chaos army. It's just a case of turning up the Khorne dial a little further. And speaking of turning up the Khorne dial, no Chaos army is complete without its Apostles and Dark Priests, and a World Eaters army is no exception. We can certainly expect to see a Lieutenant and Captain option for Angron's Legion, and I suspect one of those might be filled by something similar to the Slaughter Priests in Age of Sigmar. Basically, the Slaughter Priests are the demagogues of Khorne's followers in the mortal realms, and they not only inspire their brethren to greater acts of slaughter through prayers and booming chants, but consume the blood of their enemies to claim blessings from Khorne himself. To me, that sounds like it would fit right at home as a lieutenant or captain-like hero in Warhammer 40k, and it fills the gap that will certainly be left by sorcerers and their spells not being in the codex, given Khorne's disdain for psykers. Using a Slaughter Priest, or whatever they choose to call it, players should be able to resist psychic powers, buff their own warriors using Khorne's own prayers, and offer some additional rerolls in combat. In terms of appearance, however, I think it's just a case of imagining what the most exalted of Khorne's followers would look like. In my mind, I can see a mighty space marine whose armour has been completely emblazoned with Khorne's sigil and ordained with the skulls of his foes. In one hand he'll hold a mighty demonic weapon, and in the other the ruined remains of his last opponent, whose blood is pouring out onto a carved sigil of Khorne in the ground and ushering another mighty boon for his devout and bloodthirsty kin. And that mental image, funny enough, is what gets me most excited with this release. We're going to see some incredible models and conversions when the World Eaters come out, and I think it's going to be really fun to see how people explore different looks and kit bashes when it comes to bringing Angron and his Legion to life. So that tackles some of the more mortal units that I think we'll see with the World Eaters, but what might we get in terms of heavy armour? Well, the next one is a bit of a swing, but it's the sort of model that I think Stu Black was teasing when he said that there's some things that we may not expect coming with this range. Over the last few weeks we've been seeing plenty of news about the new Horus Heresy set, and truthfully this is an important one for Games Workshop because they're investing a lot into bringing Forge World resin sets into the world of plastic. And as we've seen with the new Spartan Assault Tank, it's not just the small sets they're translating over, they're bringing the big stuff into plastic too. The reason for this is largely to do with the economics of plastic versus resin, and while I'm no expert, my local GW store manager told me that resin is cheap to build a cast for but expensive to make, and plastic is the other way round. So if you're mass producing something like a new box set, it can be more affordable to invest in the plastic moulds and make it that way, not to mention easier on collectors. In any case, the point I'm trying to make is that I think we're going to see more and more stuff come over from Forge World into the core plastic ranges, and when it comes to the World Eaters, what could be more iconic than a brass scorpion? Now, many of us aren't all that familiar with the Brass Scorpion, or Greater Brass Scorpion as it's also known, since it's a Forge World specialist model, but it's actually a rather infamous monstrosity in the Warhammer 40k lore. They are the largest demon engine encountered by the Imperium and have been a particular focus for the Inquisition, given how devastating their appearance in various conflicts has been on Imperial forces, notably so in the Siege of Thrax. It's also a really cool design. It encapsulates that animalistic brutality that sits behind Khorne as a deity, and in a way that is so distinctive. There's nothing quite like this in the whole Chaos range. Also, sitting alongside the Lord of Skulls, having the Brass Scorpion available in plastic would give a serious amount of heavy support to World Eaters players, which will offset the fact that they might not have access to many other vanilla Chaos vehicles and long range options. Again, even a Predator doesn't feel very Khorne-like when you think about it. And let's not forget that the 40k game is becoming increasingly dominated by Imperial Knights and other heavy vehicles, which the Scorpion can counterbalance with its Demolisher and Scorpion cannons, in addition to its claws with their built-in chain weapons. It can even use its Hellmaw cannons, two massively heavy flamers, to help deal with those pesky horde armies that you might come across. Overall, I think the Brass Scorpion is just a great fit for the new World Eaters range, particularly given its importance in the lore and the fact that we're seeing a gradual transition of Forge World models from resin to plastic. However, in the absence of all of that, I'll ask a quick question. If the Brass Scorpion is known as the Greater Brass Scorpion, what might a Lesser Brass Scorpion be? And finally, I think we'll also see a terrain piece come as part of the World Eaters launch, and I sense it could be an important part of how the faction plays. When I think back to my days of playing Khorne in Warhammer Fantasy, I remember how many of the rules pushed me to charge at every opportunity. After all, you're leading an army of bloodthirsty fanatics, you can't really stop them mid-battle to discuss strategy. Personally, I hope there's something similar for World Eaters, rules that push players to charge the enemy constantly and let their warriors be overcome by their bloodlust, albeit incentivised with some nice buffs and command abilities in exchange for rushing in again and again. However, that type of play, whether it's written into the rules or not, doesn't necessarily play too well into the idea of holding objectives. For example, how easy do you think it is to persuade Khorne Berserkers to hold their ground because that shrine is worth much more than butchering those guardsmen a few metres away? Not that easy, I suspect. So if you're going to play aggressively with the World Eaters, as you should, you'll likely need something to help you hold those objectives once you've secured them. And given that most followers of Khorne aren't going to want to do that, I wonder if a terrain piece could do so instead. Touching back on my Slaughter Priest idea from earlier, what if there was a way to consecrate captured objectives and the land surrounding them? This could be in the form of a blood shrine that appears out of the ground in answer to the Slaughter Priest's prayers, or something as simple as the blood of the slain bubbling up from underneath. Whatever it is, I think it will be reasonably small, nothing like a Noctilith crown, but rather a set of models like the Convergence of Dominion. That terrain might then count towards holding that objective, at least in terms of victory points, and can either offer penalties to enemy units that try to recapture it again, or buff your own warriors if they should try to force others off of it. I must admit, it's not a fully formed idea in my mind, but just as we have terrain for different factions and indeed other Chaos Legions, I feel pretty confident that some sort of terrain piece is coming. And given the issue of holding objectives when you're a follower of Khorne, it might just be the only model in the range that actually stays still long enough for you to earn those victory points and win the game. So those are just a few of my personal suggestions for what could be coming with the new World Eaters release. I should say that, like many of you, I'm just really excited that we're finally getting a new Chaos Legion supplement, and anything that comes with that is just as great to see. I do also feel for Emperor's Children fans, and here's a silver lining, given how much the quality of sculpts has improved over these last few years, I think they'll be worth the wait, particularly when you think about their aesthetic and how detailed some of those models are undoubtedly going to be. But it's Khorne's party for now, and I'm keen to hear what you're expecting from their range, so let me know in the comments below. We should see the draft rules in White Dwarf in a couple of months or so, and I suspect we'll get more news about their models throughout the year. In the meantime, I want to say a big thank you for joining me today. If you like this video, please do consider clicking the like button, leaving a comment, and perhaps even subscribing to the channel. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you'll join me for my next one. Until then though, do take care.